Hey everybody, good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're listening to this. Hope everybody is doing well and had a very nice week. I wanted to start off this lesson by just recapping and reminding everybody of what the schedule is going to look like as best as we can estimate for the rest of the year. So we're going to go through Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, and then John. And as you can see on this page, Mark is the shortest of all the Gospels, so this will be the last week for Mark. And then Matthew, Luke, and John probably need a little bit more time, especially John, as that is a little more philosophical in nature and needs a little more interpretation. But one thing that's going to happen, and assuming that our schedule is right, is Easter is going to be coming up early May. And so we may adjust a little bit the timing of what we talk about towards the middle of April. I'd like to focus more on the Easter story in a lot of detail. We'll touch on the Easter story in Mark, Matthew, and Luke because they overlap, but I'd like to really kind of dive into it. I'm not going to go into too much detail on on the Easter story in Mark, Matthew, and Luke because I want to save it for when we're closer to Easter. And again, we just have to be flexible because, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID and how often we're going to continue to be 1 week in, 1 week out. So I just want to be flexible, but I want to give you an idea of high-level thoughts of what we're going to be doing for the rest of the year. So as we move to page 3, this is the same page from 2 weeks ago, but I just wanted to highlight a couple things. We're still working on Mark this week and finishing it off. But I wanted to just remind everybody, Matthew, Mark, and Luke basically overlap. I mean, they were written at slightly different times and for slightly different audiences, but they really overlap with Jesus's life and some of the stories. So, we can view those kind of all together as different, views on the same kind of life that Jesus had. So while we finish Mark, we're going to kind of revisit Jesus's life through Matthew and Luke's writings, but it's the same time frame, right? And I just want you guys to be reminded of that. Whereas John is a different kind of view of it at a more high level, let's call it. So we're going to finish Mark. Again, Mark's going to end up with Jesus' crucifixion and what happens afterwards, and you'll see similar things like that in Matthew and Luke. But John kind of brings it all together, and it's really a different look versus Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I just wanted to remind everybody that as we're going through these chapters. As we move to page 4, again, it's a reminder of what Mark's gospel is all about, right? And really all the gospels, it's about this good news, the story of Jesus, who is the Son of God, who will die for our sins, but gives us, in essence, the keys to get everlasting life. And one of the interesting things that I was reading about on Mark is, his sort of key, viewership or readership was the Romans and talking about Jesus's life. And towards the end of Mark, it actually ends as Jesus has died on the cross. A Roman soldier states that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, the true Messiah. And it's sort of an interesting, reinforcement by Mark to say, look, as Romans, you're recognizing that he really is who he said he was, and he is the key for everlasting life for everyone. But in general, all the Gospels, right, are kind of professing at a very high level the same theme, that Jesus is the Son of God, and it's about Jesus trying to convince people, right, because they didn't know at the time that he really was. And so what does he have to do? He has to explain to them and teach them and show them who he really is. All right, on page 5, just a quick recap of the earlier parts of Mark that we've covered in past lessons. So Mark starts with Jesus in Galilee, and again, this was the first one written. It's an introduction on who Jesus is. Jesus gets baptized. Jesus heals people, a number of feeds people, a number of parables and stories about Jesus. And then Jesus goes from Galilee to Jerusalem, but he goes to a mountain with his disciples. And this is what we talked about last lesson in class. And we kind of focused on Simon Peter and the story of fishing and how he ended up fishing for men, right? And this idea that, he needed help because he knew he was going to die. And he needed help to have his word spread after he dies. So he needed to convince his disciples, who really, it took a lot of convincing for them. Like, they thought the king of the God's son and the Messiah was going to be this powerful military kind of person, and he was really the opposite. He was somebody who was going to suffer and die, but there was a reason for that. And so he went up to a mountain and worked with his disciples, and frankly, the disciples still probably weren't 100% convinced, even through all of the lessons that Jesus did and gave to them. So then that last part of Mark, which we'll cover chapters 11 through 16, he goes to Jerusalem, and we'll go, that's what we're going to focus on in the next few pages. So on page 7, we go through this last section of Mark, which is chapters 11 through 16. And it really goes through quickly the kind of this final week and then what happens after Jesus died. If you recall, Mark is the shortest of all the Gospels. So Mark writes this like just story after story of sort of the high points of this last week. And it starts with Jesus arriving and being celebrated by the disciples, right? The believers who feel they've seen the miracles and they've listened to his words, and they feel he is the true Messiah and the true Son of God. And one of the first things Jesus does after coming into Jerusalem is he goes to the temple, and he overthrows tables and, kind of, criticizes the money changers, etc., because this is his world, and this is supposed to be a holy place. And what happens there is, the priests see this, the priests at the time, and are scared of his authority, right? I mean, that's kind of their job, and that they're rulers, and so he's infringing on their world. So they then start to plot to destroy him with the Romans. And obviously, this is a key part for Jesus, who has to die for our sins, right? So they work together in the story that has to happen for Jesus to die and suffer for us, so we can ultimately have this everlasting life. And so on page 8, we get to the last part of Mark. And again, it is just full of things that happen in the end of Jesus's life, and things that happen, kind of shortly thereafter. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail here, because we're going to revisit this a few other times through Matthew and through Luke, and maybe when we get closer to Easter, we can really sort of dive into some of these chapters. But the idea of Mark is, again, explaining and really going into detail about first Jesus telling the disciples, look, I'm going to die and I'm going to suffer, but you're going to be persecuted afterwards, right? Like, we're changing the world here. I'm the Son of God, and this is a massive, massive change for people who were living at the time. And so you will be persecuted by those people in power, right? And then we move on to the Last Supper, right? So he knows this is going to be, the end for him, And we go through, when you think about what we do for communion every week, this is my body, this is my blood, this is given up for you for your everlasting life. This is sort of one of the key components of our faith and our religion. And so Mark talks about what happens at the Last Supper, and then we go through Jesus' rest and crucifixion, which again, during Easter, we celebrate this by going through on a nightly basis all the things that are happening during Holy Week. Beyond that, Mark ends with, after he's died, a Roman soldier looks up and says, kind of comes to that realization that Jesus is the Son of God and the true Messiah. And it's key that Mark did this, because Mark's kind of target audience for this were Romans who, it was really the persecuted Romans who were believing in Christianity, but this sort of solidifies or helps to solidify their faith and understanding of who Jesus was. And it's not on this page, and again, we'll get into this later, but it really closes with Jesus, being entombed, and two women come to kind of clean everything, but the stone is rolled back, and they're told by sort of an angelic figure to alert everybody that Jesus has risen. And that's kind of how it ends. So it's almost a cliffhanger of a ending for the readers, and that's when you then get into Matthew and then Luke and John for further clarity. But it's it's a short gospel, beginning to end relatively, but it is really full of great stories and understanding of who Jesus is.